It was 45 years ago now. Sounds a long time. Wasn't actually. I mean, cars aren't that different now. They're still ground effect Formula One cars for Pete's sake, and rallies are more or less the same. They go through rivers, they go over jumps. But it does nonetheless give us an opportunity to remember that in a small passage of time between July 13 and July 24 in 1980, a driver called Carlos Reutemann finished third in the British Grand Prix, round of the Formula One World Championship, and then a few days later, third in a round of the World Rally Championship in his home country of Argentina, the Codasur Rally. An amazing achievement, probably never will be equalled again by any driver in the history of the sport, I suspect. 2 third places, 2 podium finishes in consecutive events, from a Williams FW07 to a Fiat 131 Abarth rally, from the curves and the undulations of Brands Hatch to rocky roads, to river passages, to jumps, to mountain climbs, and also to the podium in Argentina. Carlos Reutemann, who, like another of his famous predecessors, Juan Manuel Fangio, began his career in rallying. It was the easiest way to get into motorsport in Argentina. Carlos grew up in rural Santa Fe, went to a very strict Jesuit school, but very quickly, at a young age, began to enjoy the feel of sliding a car around on the farm, on the fields, and on the gravel roads. He competed in rallying before he took up racing. Here he is, looking confident, but nonetheless slightly wary. And he kept in touch with Fiat through the years, partly through the local dealership in Santa Fe, Grossi Fiat, and also with his friendship with Luca Montezemolo over in Italy. And of course it was with Montezemolo's assistance that Carlos joined the Ferrari team at the back end of 76 and raced for them very successfully in 77 and 78. And that link continued. Daniel Ordetto was Ferrari team manager in 1976, but he moved into the Fiat group, and he too was a Carlos fan. And it's not clear, I never asked Carlos this question, but it's not clear exactly whose idea it was to do the Codasur. I suspect it was Carlos, over a pasta, over a San Pellegrino with Luca, or indeed Daniel Ordetto at some point, who said, yeah, wouldn't it be good to do a rally? He loved that Fiat 131 Abarth, there's no doubt about that. Had massive respect for Walter Röhrl as well, who was winning rallies at that point. But here was Carlos wanting to do his home event, even though it fell between 2 World Championship Formula One Grand Prix, the British Grand Prix and the German Grand Prix in 1980. But of course, not only were they the days when drivers like Carlos could kind of do what they wanted to do between races, but also he had a very special relationship with Frank Williams. And although Frank had zero interest in rallying, and all he wanted from Carlos was a totally professional performance week in, week out. When Carlos did say to Frank, I think I go to Argentina, I do a small rally there. I think Frank probably said, yeah, no problem, get on with it, Carlos. And the funny thing is that Carlos wore the overalls that he had 3 or 4 sets of overalls for that 1980 season in Formula One. They're the overalls he wore in the rally as well, complete with the Williams badge on them as well. Simpson and Stan 21 overalls, mix and match. So Carlos spent a lot of time, obviously, first negotiating the whole thing with Fiat. And the agreement was that he would run a 4th factory prepared in Italy, Fiat 131, alongside Walter Röhrl, Markku, Alén, and Attilio Bettega. A big thing for Carlos to have that, in front of his home crowd as well. And from the Fiat group, he would be delegated a very, very good co-driver, Markku Perissuti. And obviously a key to Carlos doing well in the rally was building an initial and very quick relationship with Markku, and that he did. Both of them quite studious, obviously Carlos very studious, Markku too, and immediately took to Carlos's approach. But before we get on to the rally in detail, just a recap of what had been going on in Formula One for Carlos. Big win for Carlos in the Monaco Grand Prix that year. Brands Hatch wasn't such a great race for him. He finished third, he was on the podium, as I say, but it was a Ligier-dominated qualifying session. Alan Jones, the compounds were very marginal there, the Goodyear compounds on that weekend. And Alan pushed very hard from the start, pushed the Ligiers hard. The Ligiers faded, Alan won the race. Carlos's approach, and I've got to put this in the context of that 1980 season, he'd just come from a very disappointing year at Lotus. He'd wanted to get out of that Lotus deal. Even before it started, he got out around September officially. And he took a number 2 drive at Williams because he just wanted to drive a Patrick Head engineered car. And so he was quite subservient to Alan and in terms of the team as well. And he'd won Monaco. And I think his mindset then was, I'm never really going to be able to go out and race Alan and beat Alan. So he was always sort of playing the team game in 1980. And his role in 1980 at Brands Hatch was to start slowly, look after the tyres, above all try to avoid blisters. and then see what happened in the last 30 laps of the race. Two things didn't really go to plan. One was that the tyres did blister quite early on, not on Carlos's car, but on Alén's car. But he was able to drive the race with the blisters and won the Grand Prix. So the blisters in reality were a distraction. Carlos didn't get any blisters. But by the time he started to push, he was back in 4th place. And Brands Hatch, of course, very, very difficult with traffic. And you get behind a car, there was no GPS, there were no impeding regulations back then. Carlos could lose 2 or 3 laps just getting past one car. So in the end, the best he could do was finish 3rd. It was a sort of team result for Carlos. He didn't feel great about it, but there he was on the podium, spraying the champagne alongside Nelson and Alén. So that's where he was in Formula 1. Then he flew to Argentina. I think the best way to try to capture this rally, because obviously there's not a lot of footage and there was not a lot of coverage of it in Europe, but there was some great reporting by Corsa and El Gráfico magazines in Argentina. And so what I'd like to do now is read some of the reports and some of the first-hand accounts from Carlos from the rally. These have never been seen or read before, I think, in the English language. So this is Carlos Reutemann's 1980 Côte d'Azur, when he finished 3rd on the podium, 6 days after, and the rally began 6 days after that British Grand Prix. So this is an initial article in Corsa magazine before the rally, and there wasn't at this point absolutely sure that Carlos was going to be allowed or could do the rally. And so to repeat, this is in Corsa. This is written in the 3rd person by a Corsa journalist at the moment. Tuckerman lived a different week that year, not as peaceful as it would be normally. This was firstly due to the arrival of Carlos Reutemann on Wednesday afternoon, and then due to the arrival of Diego Maradona the next day, the two figures staying in different hotels but only 20 meters from one another. For this reason, a sector of the city centre seemed like a concentration camp as thousands of people circled around the hotels trying to get the signature of their two idols. And in true Reutemann style, as expected, it was the same Wednesday afternoon that he made contact with the car. He didn't waste any time, in other words. Expected by the Fiat team, headed by Oscar Marcolongo and the Italian Mirko Perizzuti, his co-driver, official navigator of the Fiat Ritmo Italia team. That's where he came from. With Mirko, Reutemann headed that same afternoon towards the Villeneuves first stage, which would be the first stage of the Côte d'Azur rally, and travelled the stage twice, just as it would be on the first day of the rally. And this, of course, is before the British Grand Prix. At night he went to rest early, and the next day at 7:15 the route of what will be the second stage of the rally began, heading towards Salta. This stage was marked as the hardest of the entire rally, and therefore Reutemann was paying particular dedicated attention to each section. But nevertheless he could not finish doing it, nor recognise what the third stage would be, because 80 kilometres from Salta the Fiat's engine broke due to a lack of oil pressure. Therefore Carlos returned to Santa Fe, to his home, after a stopover in Buenos Aires to prepare for his next trip to Europe. It was on the drive back to his farm in Santa Fe that we spoke to him and asked him about his upcoming potential rally. "I'm crazy about this car and I want to do the rally, but I still don't know if I can," said Carlos. "Time is my worst enemy. I'll only be able to solve it when I'm in Europe and see how my next work plan goes." The car is just incredible. Always there, always climbing. It's just a bulldozer. I don't know how to define it well, but I assure you that until today I had no idea what a 1980 rally car was. In many sections I stopped to look behind, because if you go down a dirt or gravel road, you have the car ploughing in low gear. There's nothing left of the road. For example, when you drive on a bad, very thick gravel road with big stones, the only thing the car does is jump. But on this car, nothing broke and nothing fell apart. I went to cross a river and put it in full second gear to pass quickly and not get stuck, and the car just passed as if it was a war tank. This is Carlos talking. As for the driving technique, the first day I studied it a lot on the way to the Villeneuves. Then I worked with everything I had. It costs you a little at first. The steering is heavy and the handling in general has its own technique. For example, they told me that most drivers like to get the nose in a little bit and then straighten the car with the rear. This, of course, wasn't Carlos's style ever. He was a short corner driver of enormous talent. So I thought it was quite interesting the way he describes it. But for me, it was more successful to put the nose into the rope of the curve. I've been trying to work out what that means, but I think it means he's just sort of going in, following the radius of the corner, but just going in tighter slightly than the radius. In other words, short corner. And then make it go backwards just a little bit. And then so in other words, he just gets the back end out slightly just to get the balance with the handbrake, but then always accelerating at that point. Because it seems to me that if you go too far wide,
Peugeot 205
you're wasting
16
time.
turbo.
There's Carlos Reutemann actually saying it. But of course, this has to be a very special technique. I think this will be a barbaric and highly contested rally. The car will be one of the candidates of winning, obviously, but we also have to take into account the Mercedes of Hannu Mikkola, because there are very fast sectors, and the Opels, I know they're coming as well. Obviously, correct tyre choice is going to be critical, as is reliability. The car has very good power-to-weight ratio. What varies the most is the driving technique and the physical appearance of the drivers. I will talk to Frank very calmly about this topic, about doing the rally. Yes, he's pretty good. He was good at what he meant calmly was sort of buttering up Frank's side, where he just loved Carlos and loved the way Carlos thought. And there would have been some misgivings in Frank's mind, but Carlos would have known and did know from day one that Frank was never going to stop him doing it. And there's a lovely little turn of phrase here as well from Carlos. He says, the Fiat is a car that requires a special technique and it's difficult to hold your hand. In other words, the Fiat doesn't make it very comfortable for you. But when you do, you can do what you want with it and will always respond. This is what Markku, his co-driver, said. This is before they even made the decision ultimately to do the rally, or Carlos made the commitment. He said, Carlos was very careful at the beginning, but then he did everything perfectly. In one section along the Cuesta del Obispo, which is winding and very slippery, I was certain that I was with a driver who was very, very quick and very, very competent. At no stage did he have a compromised maneuver, despite always having the car crossed up and sideways. In a word, he mastered it very quickly, and that's why my first contact with Carlos was nothing but positive. Carlos is like Walter Röhrl, that is 80% intuitive. There are drivers who listen to the navigator, but who almost always resolve each situation in the simplest way. Röhrl does this, Carlos does this. Sometimes they make mistakes and things go wrong, but generally they make everything easier and faster. Alén, for example, is the complete opposite of that, since he drives according to the program. He has one of the best accompanist co-drivers, and so he leaves very little to improvisation. This is another theory, but it has the disadvantage that drivers with these characteristics work like computers, and when something strange appears on the road or on the route sheet, they look complicated. I don't know which is the best formula, but both are effective. One thing I know is that Carlos took the Walter Röhrl system completely naturally, and what it has done so far is very, very good. I mean, his handbrake work was just brilliant. But logically, he will need more hours to fight under equal conditions. Nowadays, the Rally Championship is as tough as the Formula One Championship. This is 1980, and lots of practice is required to know the car, how the aids and equipment work, and also to have enough time to travel the roads well. So that was the build-up. Of course, then he did get permission from Frank Williams to do this, and after that, it was just like an explosion. And again, this is where I start to go to read the first-person reports from Carlos that appeared in Corsa and El Grafico magazines. Anyway, this is a little bit disjointed in terms of the overall picture of the rally, but because these are the actual words of Carlos, I think it's worth repeating them 45 years onwards. It seems to me that I'm living in another world. I'd wanted to run a rally for years, and happily I was able to do it at this opportunity in my home country. And at the end of it, I was also able to finish well classified. His way of saying on the podium. I think today they'd just be going, he's on the podium. From Carlos's point of view, he was well classified. Didn't win it, he's just well classified. I love it. Honestly, everything turned out perfectly for me, and I confess that I lived an exciting adventure because I never thought that motorsport would have such a special reputation in my country. Reaching the end of any stage meant an odyssey for the people in the organisation and the police in the area, because the audience just burst into a single shout of encouragement for me. All that was a new world that I lived, and only now I understand that the public that goes to the Buenos Aires Autodrome to see the Grand Prix, the Formula One Grand Prix, has nothing to do with these people who also know me and enjoy me in their own way.
For me, Argentina has been one of my favorites because it's, in terms of diversity, an amazing rally, an amazing challenge. It has been one of the longest rallies of the calendar as well. And then the Argentinian crowds are just amazing. 100,000 of fans. And stages like El Condor, Mina Clavero, very unique stages which made history and which should be back in the WRC calendar.